Are you looking for the raw truth about the U.S. healthcare system? Medical practice manager, owner, entrepreneur, and author James Egidio, with 23 plus years in the medical field, educates and informs his listeners about the changes, trends, and truth about the United States healthcare system. James interviews medical experts in various fields of the healthcare industry. Doctors, nurses, medical specialists, scientists, and professors that discuss the state of the U.S. healthcare system today, tomorrow, and in the future.
Hi, everyone. I'm James Egidio, your host of the Medical Truth Podcast, the podcast that provides you, the listener, with the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth about the U.S. healthcare system. You're listening to episode number 1, which is simply titled, Welcome to the Medical Truth Podcast. In this episode, I will discuss what is the Medical Truth Podcast, what the Medical Truth Podcast is not, who I am and what qualifies me to host a medical podcast, and finally, what inspired me to launch the Medical Truth Podcast. But before I get started, I'd like to read this disclaimer to you, and that is, the Medical Truth Podcast does not give out medical advice or encourage you to go against your personal physician's orders. In fact, the Medical Truth Podcast and its associated content, that is, the websites, articles, podcast episodes, and the like, provide general and well-researched content based on experts with years of experience. And the content is not intended, it should not be considered or used as a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Please consult with your personal physician. Now that I got that out of the way, I'd like to talk about what is the Medical Truth Podcast. The Medical Truth Podcast is hosted by me again, James Egidio. It's an uncensored platform that provides a voice for guests from all areas of the healthcare industry, such as doctors, nurses, medical specialists, authors, scientists, nutritionists, researchers, professors, attorneys, and even former patients who bear their personal testimony of healing and or injury. The Medical Truth Podcast is a podcast that bridges the gap between expert guests with years of experience and knowledge in their field and you, the listener, with factual information that educates and informs you, the listener, in order to improve your overall health rather than information that is based on speculation, censorship, lies, hype, and special interest with the medical establishment. That is, the pharmaceutical and insurance industry. And again, the Medical Truth Podcast is a podcast that tells the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth about the American healthcare system. Also, the Medical Truth Podcast is a podcast that affords you, the listener, to be a free and critical thinker based on content from expert guests who have years' experience in their chosen field. What the Medical Truth Podcast is not, because I know personally how serious the public takes their health, the Medical Truth Podcast does not take a news or journalistic gotcha approach by presenting content with gross exaggeration, malice, lies, or parrot information from corrupt bought-off agencies or organizations in order to get likes on social media or more podcast downloads. The Medical Truth Podcast is not a podcast that is looking to debate, dispute, divide, or deceive you, the listener and viewer. I think we've all had enough of that in the last 3 years with masked versus unmasked, vaccinated versus unvaccinated, and besides, this is unhealthy for everyone. The Medical Truth Podcast does not present its content based on conspiracy theories or gaslighting, but only through guests who are professionals in their given field with years of experience and knowledge. And finally, the Medical Truth Podcast does not debate topics based on politics or political parties, since this does not serve you, the listener, very well and is very divisive and bad for your health. The Medical Truth Podcast is a serious podcast with one goal in mind, and that goal is to serve you, the listener, with solid information so that you can make sound decisions based on your God-given rights and freedoms. I'm going to take a short commercial break, and when I come back, I will discuss what qualifies me to host a medical podcast.
When you need a prescription filled immediately, go to quickrxrefill.com for an online doctor consultation and prescription. Whether you left your prescription at home while traveling, are in between doctors, or just simply ran out of your medication, visit quickrxrefill.com now. Consult with a U.S. licensed physician online, and within minutes, get your prescription filled at your local pharmacy. It's that quick, and it's that easy. Plus, not only is quickrxrefill.com safe and secure, they're private and affordable, with a 100% money-back guarantee. And they understand how important getting regular medication on time is to staying healthy, especially if you have a chronic condition. Visit quickrxrefill.com now to sign up and talk to a doctor within minutes. That's quickrxrefill.com.
Welcome back to the Medical Truth Podcast. Before I took the commercial break, I discussed what the Medical Truth Podcast is and what the Medical Truth Podcast is not. Now I'd like to discuss a little bit about what qualifies me to host a medical podcast, and that is I bring about 24 years of hands-on experience as a medical practice owner, manager, entrepreneur, and even an author of some medical publications that I wrote for physicians. And because of my interest in biology and chemistry, coming out of high school, I attended the University of Nevada at Las Vegas, as well as the University of Nevada at Reno. When I graduated in 1981, I had aspirations to be a pre-med student and had studied biology and chemistry. And like a lot of students, I had a lot of fun over the years, which was interesting. And I took some time off. I took some time off from college in 1987, 88 for about 7 years up until 94. And I got involved in the nutritional supplement industry where I was formulating nutritional supplements and marketing them. And I started a company back then called Future Science Labs. My slogan at that time was working with science today for a healthier tomorrow. And I formulated the first herbal Viagra back in 1990. A really good time doing that. It was fun at that time because the business climate was a lot different. There was no internet, so it was primarily mail order, and then it led into wholesale distribution of the products through distributors. And then I had an opportunity to form a business alliance with a father and son at that time, and we ended up, like I say, distributing the products wholesale through distributors. So at that time, I was like, you know what, I got to go back to school. And I went back to college and enrolled to finish up my biology chemistry degree. And I had aspirations to be a cardiothoracic physician assistant. And at that time, I was working at clinics, a lot of medical clinics. I worked at several medical clinics and served for the time with the American Red Cross, doing volunteer work, and then working in clinics with paid positions in both the front office and back office. I was getting a lot of experience while I was aspiring to try to get into a physician assistant program, like I said, to become a cardiothoracic physician assistant. I applied to Cornell. I applied to Bowman Gray, which is Wake Forest University School of Medicine. And I was granted 2 interviews 2 years in a row. One of the schools was the College of Osteopathic Medicine of the Pacific. And I got rejected from the program. But I had a lot of medical experience. And I was at a crossroads in my career with tons of clinical experience and business experience of managing medical practices. I believed that I could operate a medical practice better than most of my employers. So what I did in 1998 is I launched a medical house call practice called House Call Doctors, which was a mobile medical practice. And of course, that same year, Medicare was reimbursing and encouraging physicians to conduct medical house calls. So I formed a business partnership with a local medical doctor. And I partnered with this local doctor from 1998 till about 2009. And I handled the marketing, the advertising, of course, assisted physicians, and did the medical billing. I did everything. I was a hands-on practice manager. And we catered primarily to a very pleasant senior population who had a lot of course, backstories It was really cool. And it was an awesome time in my medical career. And then in 2001, during the time I was operating and owning the medical practice, the medical house call practice, that is, I published 3 comprehensive books and business manuals that I marketed to physicians. And one was titled A Physician's Complete Guide to a Successful Medical House Call Practice. And I revised that for nurse practitioners. And I titled that A Nurse Practitioner's Complete Guide to a Successful Medical House Call Practice. And then I wrote a third publication called Learn How to Start a Cash-Only Medical Practice. Well, it wasn't until 2008 and 2009 when I transitioned the medical house call practice into a fee-for-service, cash-only, low-cost medical practice, bricks-and-mortar practice, that is. And I did that from 2009 up until 2020, right after the COVID outbreak. And with that practice, it was wonderful because we saved patients who were both uninsured and underinsured thousands of dollars in savings from having to go bankrupt for medical services. I was saving a lot of money for patients when it came to like lab work, imaging studies. And I even remember one patient who needed complete hip replacement. She was young at the time. She was like 38 years old. And the surgery would have cost a couple $100,000. But instead, I had formed an alliance with a local orthopedic surgeon, and it ended up costing her only $10,000 out of pocket. That was really a fulfilling practice and career. It was a 24-year career, and I found myself as a patient advocate, helping patients and helping clients come through the door with the medical services. That, I feel, lent and gave me a lot of experience in the medical industry and a lot of knowledge. And that's pretty much my background in the medical field. I'm going to take a short commercial break, and when I come back, I'll discuss what inspired me to launch the Medical Truth Pod.
When you need a prescription filled immediately, go to quickrxrefill.com for an online doctor consultation and prescription. Whether you left your prescription at home while traveling, are in between doctors, or just simply ran out of your medication, visit quickrxrefill.com now. Consult with a U.S. licensed physician online, and within minutes, get your prescription filled at your local pharmacy. It's that quick, and it's that easy. Plus, not only is quickrxrefill.com safe and secure, they're private and affordable with a 100% money-back guarantee. And they understand how important getting regular medication on time is to staying healthy, especially if you have a chronic condition. Visit quickrxrefill.com now to sign up and talk to a doctor within minutes. That's quickrxrefill.com.
Okay, welcome back to the Medical Truth Podcast. Before I took the commercial break, I discussed a little bit about my background in the medical industry and about me. What I'd like to do now is finish up this episode by discussing what inspired me to launch the Medical Truth Podcast. And it all started in 2020 when the COVID outbreak occurred. And with 24 years of experience in the healthcare industry as a medical practice owner and manager with hands-on practice management experience, as well as a patient advocate, I knew something did not seem right as to the way the medical establishment handled the pandemic, especially since having gone through a COVID virus outbreak, which I'm not sure if a lot of you who are listening and viewing realize that in 2003, we had what was called SARS, or sudden acute respiratory syndrome. And at that time, I owned and managed and even had gone out with the doctors to render medical services in the medical house call setting. And back then, I remember getting a really nasty flu back then. It was sudden acute respiratory syndrome, which was a COVID virus outbreak. And we lost a lot of the senior population back then due to that flu, as well as a lot of pediatric patients. And there was never a peep or mention of it from the media like there was in 2020. So I knew something was wrong. So after seeing through all that, and especially with the draconian lockdowns and businesses shutting down, I noticed that the narrative was changing, and I'm sure a lot of you saw that, from one day to another with medical experts and even non-medical experts in the media and entertainment industry, big tech, as well as politics in both parties. In fact, it became a political football at that time because we were in the middle of an election year, and both parties were guilty of using it to their advantage and making it a political football. And none of the institutions had any business leading the narrative as far as I was concerned. And they were also providing these half-baked information to the public. It was very reckless and malicious, and it did not serve you, the public, well in the United States and even throughout the world. So I felt it was a disservice to the public as a whole of what was happening. And I wanted to throw a shoe at the television set. Like a lot of people, I was listening to it real intently and carefully because it stirred my interest being in the medical industry. And at that time, I still had the practice open during COVID because it all started in early 2020. It started around February and March. And I even remember there were rumors about this virus outbreak, and they called it Corona, and there was some overtones that it was associated with the beer, Corona beer, and there were even jokes about it. And then the narrative started to get revved up during that time, and the media started to get a hold of it. And when they got a hold of it, it just became like almost a sick joke. And I was getting very upset about it. So I said to myself, I want to really launch in the summer of 2020 a podcast and really get the word out there. But I felt deep down inside that it was a little too premature to do something like that and to bring out the truth about the pandemic. And I felt that there was more truth to come out over time. I just felt the timing wasn't right to come out with this podcast. And then the other issue I was witnessing was extremely credible people during that time, doctors, scientists, and researchers, who had years of experience under their belt with a lot to lose, who were being censored. And I felt like I had to provide them with a platform and a voice eventually, which a lot of them already are doing with their own platforms and organizations that they formed since, and they were courageous enough to come out. Doctors like Peter McCullough and Dr. Peter Breggin and Dr. Judy Mikovits. And then there were actual documentaries by Mickey Willis and several people who came out with some really credible stuff. And they're still being censored to this day and challenged based on their expertise. And they're being challenged by a bunch of people in the media who have no experience in the medical industry. They have no background in the medical industry. And it's just really frustrating. The pandemic is not only time professionals were being censored, but the pharmaceutical and insurance industry was doing the same thing. But I also feel like there's a silver lining to all this, is that the COVID pandemic became the flashpoint that exposed the corruption throughout the medical industry. I feel like it all happened for a good reason. And like I said, there's a silver lining behind it all. But anyway, that's what inspired me to launch this podcast and to educate and inform the public, not only just based on the pandemic, but just the medical industry as well, by bringing on guests that are experts in their field from different areas. So I don't want to primarily just focus on this pandemic like a lot of people do and parrot the negative of it. I think that it opened up a Pandora's box for a lot of good things for the public. to open up their eyes and see what's really going on. But I just thank you so much for joining me for this episode and future episodes of the Medical Truth Podcast. And I really appreciate you joining me for this episode. And for episodes of the Medical Truth Podcast, that is the show notes, videos, and more information and links to my guest work, you can go to www.medicaltruthpodcast.com. That's www.medicaltruthpodcast.com. I can also be found on Rumble as well, which is one of the fewer platforms that's not censoring everybody. And for now, I'm on Facebook, Twitter. I really appreciate you joining me for this episode of the Medical Truth Podcast. Thank you so much. Have a good day and God bless.
Thank you for listening to the Medical Truth Podcast. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast at www.medicaltruthpodcast.com so you don't miss any future episodes, and share with family and friends to keep them informed as well. Until next time.